Analysis of As You Like It by William Shakespeare. Act 1, Scene 1. Analysis. This first scene establishes several conflicts. The two major conflicts are between the two pairs of brothers, Oliver and Orlando, and Duke Frederick and Duke Senior. In each case, a brother is wronged, and he is wronged for the same reason, that is, he is wrong because he is well-liked and morally good. It is interesting to note that in the case of Duke Frederick and Duke Senior, it is the younger brother who is usurping the rights of the elder brother, whereas with Oliver and Orlando it is just the opposite. In his dialogue with Oliver, Orlando explains the villainy of Duke Frederick. It is the right of the firstborn male child to inherit his father's properties. Therefore, when Duke Frederick usurped the dukedom from his elder brother, he committed an unnatural act, according to the mores of the Elizabethan era. Oliver's own villainy is explained in Orlando's opening speech, in which he relates Oliver's failure to execute their father's will. Clearly, both Duke Frederick and Oliver violate the natural laws of ascendancy. Oliver's villainy is even further evident when he coldly and abruptly tells Adam, the old and faithful family servant, to leave the room. But Oliver's cruel nature is made absolutely clear when he lies to Charles, a professional wrestler, and encourages him to at least maim, if he cannot kill, Orlando. Thus, the laws governing the family are being horribly violated. Biblically, fratricide is the oldest crime of all. These unnatural acts between brothers contrast sharply with the idyllic ambience in the forest of Arden, where the main action of the play is about to occur. Already we are being prepared for these pastoral elements of the play. For example, consider the setting of Scene 1, which is set in Oliver's orchard. Although the setting is reflective of the pastoral life, it is also a part of the real world in which brother is pitted against brother. Eventually, it is to the forest of Arden, a fantasy world, which the characters will flee to sort out their problems and their loves. Scene 1 also focuses on the matter of city life versus country living, a question much in discussion in Elizabethan England and much in vogue recently. Orlando first gives voice to this question in his opening speech, when he points out that he is being kept rustically at home without the benefit of being sent away to study gentlemanly ways. Later, he decides to leave his pastoral home to seek his fortune elsewhere. This question of sophisticated city living versus the simplicity of a pastoral life runs throughout the play. It is treated in a general and slightly humorous way by Jaques in his famous All the World's a Stage speech, Act 2, Scene 7, and hilariously in the confrontation between Touchstone, the fool, and Karen, the country shepherd, Act 3, Scene 2. Yet despite the questions being considered throughout the play, it is never answered satisfactorily. In addition to the natural versus the unnatural, and city life versus country life, Shakespeare also uses the formalities of his language to establish the various social levels of his characters. For example, when Oliver first addresses Charles, he uses the formal pronoun you, but when he cunningly seeks to dupe Charles into killing Orlando, he uses the familiar pronoun thou. In other words, by his use of pronouns, Shakespeare indicates that Oliver has become condescending towards Charles. This device is used frequently throughout the play. Act I Scene 2. Analysis. This scene further reveals the pains and problems of the real world. Later, however, in the idyllic fantasy of the forest of Arden, Jax is troubled when he discovers the carcass of a deer, his velvet friend, in Act 2, Scene 1. In this real world, Shakespeare introduces and contrasts the theme of love. There is, for example, the love between Celia and Rosalind. The word love also had the connotation of friendship to the Elizabethans. Their love is pure and innocent, especially when contrasted to the complete lack of feeling between the two pairs of brothers. In a witty dialogue, Rosalind and Celia discuss the merits of love as a sport where one can fall in love and have the safety of a pure blush. In honor, this romantic love is given its due when Orlando and Rosalind fall in love at first sight. It might be noted that only a few words are exchanged between them before the shaft of Eros finds its mark. This view of love is later enhanced when Shakespeare has Phoebe quote Marlowe, "Whoever loved that loved not at first sight?" Act 3, Scene 5. Later, this view of romantic love will be satirized when Oliver falls in love with Celia, literally at first sight, Act 4, Scene 3. Still to come are Shakespeare's considerations of idealized and pastoral love. When all the characters finally come together in the fantasy forest of Arden, the many different types of love will be fully explored and exploited for serious and for comic effects. Shakespeare will also focus later on the sexual love that Touchstone feels for Audrey, and, here, this scene introduces Touchstone, who is an original with Shakespeare. As a touchstone was used in Elizabethan times to determine the purity of silver and gold, so Shakespeare uses this character to determine the sincerity of the beliefs of each character in the play. One can make a good case of the thesis that it is Touchstone, and not Jacques, who is the best critic of the characters within this play. Lebeau, judging by his elevated speech and dress, is a dandy. As such, he is satirized by Shakespeare not only for his speech and dress, but also for his mannerisms in this scene. Finally, this scene foreshadows Orlando's subsequent departure from the ducal estates to the Forest of Arden. For Orlando, as well as for many of the key characters in this scene, nothing seems to work out for him, or for them. An uneasiness pervades the tranquil setting. What is natural seems unnatural, and in the Forest of Arden, in contrast, what might seem unnatural seems very natural. In the real world, the characters must try and control themselves in a world that tries to control them. Only in the wild, fantastic, pastoral setting of the Forest of Arden can the characters give full vent to their feelings. Act I Scene 3. Analysis. Here, Duke Frederick's villainy is fully revealed. He banished Rosalind from his court because she reminds the people of her exiled father, "Thou art thy father's daughter." There's enough. He suffers no remorse when his daughter, Celia, states her intent of accompanying Rosalind. He tells Celia, "You're a fool." Thus, the stage is set for Rosalind to join her father in the Forest of Arden. There can be little doubt that Orlando will soon join the group, for we have seen that Oliver's temper is much like Frederick's. The plot is further complicated at this point with a dramatic device that was a favorite of Elizabethan audiences. When the two girls decide to go forth alone in the world, they go in disguise. Rosalind chooses to go as Ganymede, the name of a Trojan youth abducted to Olympus, where he was made the cupbearer of the gods and became immortal, and Celia chooses to go as Aliena. Shakespeare takes both names from the novel Rosalind, 1590, by Thomas Lodge. That the girls should take Touchstone with them serves two key purposes. First, the ploy is used so that a masterful critic of society will be in the Forest of Arden, and there he will, ironically and unexpectedly, fall in love with Audrey, an earthy, country woman. Second, the fact that Touchstone will accompany the girls makes him a favorite of the audience. He is a brave and loyal friend to the two heroines. Celia's concluding lines, "Now go we in content, to liberty and not to banishment," foreshadow the mood expressed in the following scene by Duke Sr., Rosalind's father. This mood of freedom, the prevailing mood of the Forest of Arden, will be expressed throughout the play. Act 2 Scene 1. Analysis. In this scene, Duke Sr. enlarges on an idea expressed by Celia at the end of Act 1. He raises the question of the pastoral life being superior to that of the city. This thought colors the mood of the scenes set in the Forest of Arden, and for the remainder of the play, are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? This sentiment will be echoed time and again in various ways. The Duke's speech is a satire on a commonplace view held at that time by many city dwellers. "Sweet are the uses of adversity," the Duke says. This is an exaggerated view of the pastoral life, where he must live in exile. But later in this scene, Jacques, a critic of the world at large, extends this already exaggerated view and contends sarcastically that the pastoral life also endorses the notion that it is necessary. to frighten the animals and to kill them up in their assigned and native dwelling place. 62-63. It is evident that Jack's view of the pastoral life is not at all practical. However, the view is typical of Jack's in that it is a shallow generalization of the situation in which he finds himself. It is also important to note that Duke Sr., while enjoying Jack's company, is not overly impressed with Jack's philosophy. "I love to cope, muse playfully with him in these sullen fits, for then he's full of matter." This is the first clue that Jack's is not to be taken too seriously. Jack's always thinks that his thoughts are profound, but they are rather ordinary and are always generalized. Shakespeare is satirizing both views here, Duke Sr.'s, that everything in nature is good, and Jack's, that nature is good only when man is not around to evoke change. Both views were popular at the time. Act 2 Scene 2. Analysis. This scene serves two purposes. First, it offers a way for Oliver to be sent to the forest of Arden, where he will meet with the other exiled characters. Now, only Orlando and Adam remain behind, yet very shortly, both of them will leave for the forest of Arden. We realize, therefore, that soon all of the main characters will arrive there, and the main action of the play will begin. Second, this scene stands in juxtaposition to the preceding scene. Whereas the preceding scene was one of pensive tranquility, Scene 2 is harsh, it is filled with tension and vengefulness. The counterbalancing of scenes, one contrasting with the other, is a dramatic device much used by Shakespeare. In this particular play, the grouping of scenes without a hint of serious movement has led some critics to compare these elements to those found in the Masque, an elaborate, light-hearted, and extravagantly costumed entertainment that was much in vogue in the 16th century. Act 2 Scene 3. Analysis. As villains in a comedy, Oliver and Duke Frederick rank only a degree below Shakespeare's best. They never reach the level of an Iago, however, simply because they are never quite successful. Their villainy is only in thought, never in deed. Duke Frederick may have usurped his brother's lands, but he cannot get rid of his brother's influence, as evidenced in Rosalind's relationship with Celia and vice versa, when Rosalind is forced to flee from the ducal court. It is interesting to note that old Adam, pictured here as goodness personified, serves as a counterbalance to the villainy of Oliver and Frederick. Falling in the middle of these extremes are the more realistic characters of Orlando, Rosalind, and Celia. Orlando's discussion of the antique world and his looking forward to a better day echo the tranquil mood of the forest of Arden, established by Duke Sr. in Act 2, Scene 1. At this point in the play, all of the major characters who are representative of courtly life are either in the forest of Arden or on their way there. It is now time to meet their counterparts from the country. Act 2 Scene 4. Analysis. The opening exposition in this scene establishes the setting for the audience. Touchstone's remark, "When I was at home, I was in a better place," focuses immediately on the theme of town life versus country life. It also reflects Touchstone's realistic outlook, a viewpoint of his which is used throughout the play as a contrast to the romantic notions of the other characters. For example, note his speech in this scene where he remembers a romance of his own, lines 46-56. Most likely, it never happened at all, but it is humorously amusing. His kissing a club, his thinking of a cow's teats when he took his beloved's hands, and his wooing a peaked, all of these are too preposterous for us to fully believe, yet his boastful speech is a perfect contrast to the pastoral notions of Sylvius, while at the same time it is a clever parody on the romantic notions of Rosalind. Additionally, in giving two cods, peepeds, to his mistress, an Elizabethan term for sweetheart, Touchstone parodies Rosalind's giving a necklace to Orlando, and, at the same time, he satirizes Sylvius' concept of pastoral love. And of historical note here, it is of interest that lovers in those days would often risk tearing a peaked from the vine without accidentally tearing it open. If successful, they would give it to their beloved as a sign of faithful devotion. Touchstone, in using the peaked to represent his love, foreshadows Orlando's use of Ganymede in place of Rosalind as a representative of his love. Finally, perhaps we should mention Rosalind's purchase of a sheepstead. This bit of business brings a bit of realism to an otherwise unrealistic play. We are surprised at the quick financial transaction. It is broad comedy, whether or not Shakespeare meant it to be, and it is always a source of laughter. Act 2 Scene 5. Analysis. The pastoral songs in this play serve several purposes. They restate the theme of town life versus country life. Town life they envision as being dismal and corrupt, while country life is fair and clean. Shakespeare, it should be noted, satirizes both views. The songs also serve to break up the tide-like action of the scenes, in other words, they bring variety to a scene in the forest being followed by a scene at court, followed by one in the forest, and so forth. Finally, the songs are part of the masque elements in this play. This genre of the masque was characterized by quickly changed scenes and tableaus with emphasis upon elaborate costumes and scenery, representative of mythological or pastoral elements. Dance and music were also essential elements. The use of the masque elements here culminates with the entrance of Hymen, the god of marriage, and the climactic triple wedding scene. The primary purpose of this scene seems to focus on Shakespeare's delineation of the character of Jacks. Jacks is always argumentative, indiscriminately taking the opposing view, never pleased with anything or anybody. He likes to think of himself as being profound, but his thoughts are of a commonplace nature and are usually vitriolic. His humor is ironic. For example, he comments that Duke Sr. is too argumentative, whereas he himself is the most argumentative character in the play. Jacks's song serves as a rebuke to the pastoral sentiment of Amyan song. Jacks, who insists that Amyan sing, afterwards criticizes what he himself wanted to hear. Again, it is to be expected that Jacks will take the opposing view in an argument, regardless of its merit. Throughout the play, he rails against the pastoral view of life, but, finally, he is the only character who chooses to remain in the forest, while the others return to the town as soon as possible. Act 2 Scene 6. Analysis. This scene serves to establish the fact that Orlando and Adam have arrived in the forest of Arden, and it prepares us for Orlando's meeting with Duke Sr. and the Duke's company in the next scene. Because Orlando attends Adam so loyally and attentively, it raises the audience's estimation of him. He is young, but he exhibits a noble character, probably inherited from his father. As always, we note his concern and courtesy toward others. He is a gentle, good youth. Act 2 Scene 7. Analysis. In no scene is the exaggerated melancholy and simple cynicism of Jacks more clearly evident than here. He opens his meeting with Rosalind's father by relating an encounter he has just had with Touchstone. In the encounter, Jacks was completely taken in by the clown. He was totally unaware that Touchstone was parodying Jack's own style of speech. Instead, Jacks found Touchstone's remarks to be so profound that he wishes that he could be a fool himself. Touchstone's comments, thus, foreshadow Jack's well-known 7 Ages of Man speech. "'Tis but an hour ago since it was 9. And after 1 hour more 'twill be 11. And so, from hour to hour, we ripe and ripe. And then, from hour to hour, we rot and rot. And thereby hangs a tale." 24-28. One might also note that the sundial that Touchstone produces is an unlikely, absurd instrument to use in a forest. That Jacks would use the sundial to time his laughter, exactly the duration of 1 hour, underscores his ridiculous behavior, as if he or anyone could laugh for a specific amount of time. Jack's character, unfortunately, has often been misunderstood. The Duke, for example, calls him a libertine. The word at that time did not carry the moral connotations it does today. Then, it merely meant a man of the world. It must also be remembered that the Duke likes to argue with Jacks, 2I.6869, and in this scene, he is drawing Jacks out to discover what Jacks is thinking. He challenges Jacks' claim to be a reformer of society. Jacques accepts the challenge. The Duke, of course, is being whimsically humorous and asks Jacques what he would disgorge into the general world, but Jacques obviously misses the Duke's humorously exaggerated attack on his overblown pomposity. Instead, he immediately seizes the bait and rants on about how he would save society. In doing so, Jacques not only has the last word, but he also absurdly satirizes late 16th century satirists. To some critics, the remark made by Orlando, "Yet am I inland bred, and know some nature," seems to contradict his speech in Act 1, Scene 1. This is not the case. Both words civility and nurture meant good breeding in the general use of the term, rather than in the modern use of politeness, and it was considered good breeding to salute those whom one met. Orlando obviously does not salute when he makes his entrance. The Duke challenges this impropriety. Jacques' division of life into 7 ages was a proverbial, as well as a popular, idea in Elizabethan England. It is an ancient idea, and Shakespeare makes reference to it in The Merchant of Venice, Act 1, Scene 1, and in Macbeth, Act 5, Scene 5. Moreover, the speech is consistent with Jacques' character. It is highly generalized, the kind of pigeonhole categorizing that his mind would be fascinated with, and it is expressed in an untutored, insightful manner. Without Jacques realizing it, he becomes a one-man chorus, delivering a keen philosophical discourse in capsule form. As a counterbalance to this philosophizing, both Jacques and Touchstone keep the audience from becoming too contemplative and also from becoming too involved with the fantasy of the forest. They serve as reminders that Duke Sr., Rosalind, and Orlando are playing only temporary parts in a masquerade in an unusual setting. Act 3 Scene 1. Analysis. This scene completes the action initiated in Act 2, Scene 2, that is, Oliver must go to the forest of Arden, where he will eventually meet with the other characters, and it is ironic that Frederick calls Oliver a villain for not loving his brother. Frederick is blatantly guilty of the same want of feeling for his brother. Act 3 Scene 2. Analysis. Orlando's hanging his verses in the trees reflects a commonplace convention in the pastoral genre of Elizabethan writers. Another convention of the time was to carve verses or names into the bark of trees. Here, Shakespeare is satirizing these conventions. Later, in the encounter between Arden and Touchstone, it is interesting to note that Arden uses the respectful and formal words master and you in addressing the clown, while Touchstone condescendingly says shepherd and uses the familiar pronoun thou. Each is amused by the other's quick mind. Touchstone is admired because of his wit, and Arden is admired because of his rustic answers. Neither takes the other too seriously, however. The role of Arden, one might note, is included as a foil to Silvius. Arden is a real shepherd who knows something about sheep, that is, about shearing and herding. In addition, he has some difficulty expressing himself, much like William and Audrey, who also are representatives of true country life. Yet his thoughts, while very often seeming homely, are shrewd. In contrast, Silvius, and later Phoebe, also, is a representative from the pastoral genre of literature. He is dressed like a shepherd, and he wanders about all the day talking of love, but he knows nothing of tending sheep. Shakespeare uses this contrast, obviously, to point out the difference between the two shepherds and, more important, to satirize the precious, romantic idealism of the pastoral genre. Also associated with this, there is a set of contrasts in Touchstone's poem and Orlando's poetry. Touchstone's poem is in a realistic vein, and it satirizes the romantic notions of Orlando's poetry. At that time, a great many love poems were composed, and many of them were as amateurishly bad as Orlando's. Many, of course, were worse. The pact between Rosalind, Ganymede, and Orlando leads to some of the most humorous moments in the play. This dramatic gimmick was not original with Shakespeare, it was borrowed from Thomas Lodge's novel Rosalind, but Shakespeare embellished it and complicated it with disguises, and, from the first production, it was a surefire success with Elizabethan audiences. who always enjoyed intricate plots and intrigue. Here, the heroine finds herself in a position to hear her lover extol her virtues and his love for her without his being aware of her identity. The dramatic irony is a touch of brilliance. Act 3 Scene 3. Analysis. Audrey, very much like Karen and, later, like William, is a realistic, country person. All are contrasts to the pastoral lovers, Sylvius and Phoebe. The relationship between Audrey and Touchstone is very realistic. This couple is concerned with sexual love, not with chaste, romantic, poetic love. Touchstone says, "We must be married, or we must live in bawdry." Contrast this realism with the verbal excesses of Sylvius, "Then shall you know the wounds invisible, that love's keen arrows make," Sylvius says to Phoebe. His words are colored with an abundance of poetic romance. Occasionally, Orlando also reaches these poetic heights. Touchstone's wooing of Audrey is particularly humorous because she never understands the sparring verbal wit of Touchstone at all. This doesn't bother her unduly, however, and it is her very lack of concern that amuses Jax, who also finds Touchstone's utterances full of profound wisdom, still one richer vein of humor in this merry comedy. Act 3 Scene 4. Analysis. This scene clearly shows us the depth of Rosaline's love for Orlando. That Celia is not in love at this time and is practical in her advice tends to make Rosalind's love seem all the more intense, of course. There is a certain degree of melodramatic pathos to the situation, and for that reason we are ready to laugh at the overindulgent love of Sylvius for Phoebe. Karen's invitation to the girls to watch the couple is a clever bit of dramatic balancing. His realistic speech offers a refreshing contrast to the romantic verbosity of the girls. Act 3 Scene 5. Analysis. The encounter between Sylvius and Phoebe is a satire on conventional love, that is, the lady feels that she is superior to her lover, and her lover, in anguish, swears to die if he is denied her love. The scene also satirizes Sylvius and Phoebe as representatives of the pastoral genre. The plot, which is already complicated by disguises, is even further complicated in this scene when Phoebe falls in love with an attractive personage who she thinks is a young man, when he is really Rosalind, who in reality was being played on Shakespeare's stage by a young man. Elizabethan audiences, however, love this kind of whimsical gender gymnastics, and even today, this kind of drag masquerade is surefire comedy, provided of course that it is done in broad humor. Act 4 Scene 1. Analysis. It is easy fun for the witty and clever Rosalind to tease Jax, and while she does so, we should be aware that she also satirizes many Elizabethan Englishmen who traveled to the continent acquiring affected behavior. Jax, of course, is unaware of her satirical teasing, and so he continues on in his sober manner. Other clues as to Jack's character are provided in this scene when Rosalind describes him as speaking with a lisp. To speak with a lisp meant that he spoke with an affected mannerism, probably acquired on his travels to the continent. She also chides Jax for turning his back, as it were, on his native country and wearing strange suits. Orlando's entrance here has been much discussed. Obviously, Jax and Rosalind are downstage, near the audience, and begin moving upstage, probably when Jax decides to leave Rosalind since she insists on talking in blank verse, meaning in the poetic language of love. Jax notices Orlando's entrance and acknowledges his greeting. Rosalind pretends not to notice his entrance and moves along, continuing to talk to Jax. As they move upstage, then, Orlando moves downstage. Thus, when Jax exits, Rosalind turns and pretends surprise. In the encounter between Ganymede and Orlando, Rosalind almost gives herself away because she is so delighted that she is being wooed by Orlando, who, of course, is unaware of her identity. It is Rosalind's utter delight that gives the scene an extraordinary depth of sweetness and gentle humor. In the mock wedding scene, it is important to note that Rosalind's fondest wish is almost made a reality. She is putting the vows of marriage upon Orlando's lips, and she herself replies, "I do take thee, Orlando, for my husband. Even in a comedy such as this, such vows are serious. Rosalind realizes this just in time and teases Orlando that men are like April when they woo and that they are December when they are wed. If she was, as Celia accused her of being earlier, harsh on women, she now turns her witty jesting toward the men. Furthermore, she warns the lovesick Orlando that she, the Rosalind of his dreams, will be more jealous of him than a Barbary cock pigeon over his hen, more clamorous than a parrot against rain, more newfangled than an ape, more giddy in my desires than a monkey. All this is possible. She is every bit as in love with Orlando as he is with her. Lovers, she is saying, are a bit mad. She realizes this truth about herself, and, thus, she half-teasingly, half-seriously, promises him that Rosalind will weep for nothing, like Diana in the fountain, and that Rosalind will weep when Orlando is disposed to be merry. Rosalind as wife will be no soft, pliant, submissive lady. Rosalind will, in fact, be herself, high-spirited and bewitchingly exciting. Act 4 Scene 2. Analysis. This scene is a sequel to the last scene. Jacques again assumes his pose as critic at large. It is characteristic of him to criticize a song before it is sung, and this song, one might note, is concerned with the horns of the deer. This is a sexual reference to a man's being a cuckold, that is, the husband of an unfaithful wife, a situation which the Elizabethan audiences never tired of as a source for comedy. Throughout all of literature, the cuckolded husband has been the butt of many comedies. Act 4 Scene 3. Analysis. In the brief exchange between Ganymede and Silvius, at first Rosalind isn't sure if Silvius is aware of the contents of the letter. She only pretends to read it, therefore, and gives a false interpretation of the contents. Finally, she asks Silvius if the letter was written by him. It is a clever ruse to discover whether or not he is aware of the contents. Realizing that Silvius is ignorant of the message, Rosalind, with compassion, reads the letter aloud, for the benefit of the audience, and attempts to misconstrue its meaning. But Silvius is not so easily duped. Rosalind, therefore, drops all pretense and reads the full letter. It is interesting here to note that Celia expresses pity for Silvius, but Rosalind, in keeping with her manly characterization of Ganymede, sneers at pity. Likewise, Ganymede's command to Phoebe, via Silvius, is in keeping with the indifference shown to Phoebe in Act 3, Scene 5. When Oliver makes his entrance, he says, "Good morrow, fair ones." The use of the word fair was in keeping with the times when men could also be described as being fair. Certainly, Oliver is unaware of Rosalind's disguise, as evidenced by his use of you in line 85, where he describes Rosalind as being both fair and a boy, and where he describes Celia as being a woman and browner than her brother. Oliver's sudden conversion from hate to love for his brother, one should note, though it might strain the credulity of a modern audience, was a commonplace device in Elizabethan plays. Sudden conversions can also be found in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well, and Cymbeline. When Oliver tells Ganymede about Orlando's wound, Ganymede faints, but Celia, being quick-witted, remembers to call her cousin Ganymede. However, Celia does slip when she inadvertently refers to Ganymede as cousin Ganymede in line 160. Luckily, Oliver misses this error on Celia's part. Rosalind, on awakening, resumes the game that she is playing with Oliver, and the comic masquerade continues as she tells him to tell Orlando that Ganymede counterfeited so well that when he heard that Orlando had been wounded, he swooned, as if he were, really, the fair, faint-hearted Rosalind. Act 5 Scene 1. Analysis. Note that in this scene, Touchstone, in addressing William, uses the condescending pronoun thou, while William uses the more respectful pronoun you. Here, William, like Audrey and Arden, is used by Shakespeare to contrast the real country characters with the pastoral lovers, Silvius and Phoebe. Characteristic of real country people, we see, is an inability to easily express themselves. The longest sentence used by William, for example, contains 6 words, and most of his sentences are 3 to 4 words in length. As an additional dramatic point, one should realize that in this encounter, William takes the remarks of Touchstone quite seriously, even though he doesn't fully comprehend them. In addition, Audrey also has trouble following Touchstone's wit, for she is just as simple as William is. However, at the beginning of the scene, Audrey does realize that it will be no easy matter to get Touchstone before the altar. Act 5 Scene 2. Analysis. By having Orlando raise the question of Oliver's sudden love for Aliena, it is possible that Shakespeare might have been trying to apologize for his departure from Lodge's novel Rosalind. In the novel, Aliena is rescued from a band of ruffians by an older brother. However, to further complicate the play with these added characters and incidents would have slowed its movement. Shakespeare was correct in omitting this plot development. Moreover, he had laid the groundwork for Oliver's sudden falling in love when Phoebe earlier quoted from Marlowe on the subject of one ove at first sight, 3v.82, and when Oliver was suddenly converted to goodness. This particular parody on romantic love illustrates the extremes between Sylvius and Phoebe on the one hand and between Oliver and Celia on the other. In contrast, true romantic love is represented in the lead characters of Orlando and Rosalind, who at least briefly engage in conversation before succumbing to romantic love. Of interest also in this particular scene is the matter of Rosalind's claiming to be a magician, capable of divining the future. Rosalind here introduces a popular topic, magic, a subject that fascinated Elizabethan audiences. In addition, Rosalind's prophesying the multiple marriages for the next day foreshadows the arrival of Hymen in the final scene. Act 5 Scene 3. Analysis. By having Orlando raise the question of Oliver's sudden love for Aliena, it is possible that Shakespeare might have been trying to apologize for his departure from Lodge's novel Rosalind. In the novel, Aliena is rescued from a band of ruffians by an older brother. However, to further complicate the play with these added characters and incidents would have slowed its movement. Shakespeare was correct in omitting this plot development. Moreover, he had laid the groundwork for Oliver's sudden falling in love when Phoebe earlier quoted from Marlowe on the subject of one ove at first sight, 3v.82, and when Oliver was suddenly converted to goodness. This particular parody on romantic love illustrates the extremes between Sylvius and Phoebe on the one hand and between Oliver and Celia on the other. In contrast, true romantic love is represented in the lead characters of Orlando and Rosalind, who at least briefly engage in conversation before succumbing to romantic love. Of interest also in this particular scene is the matter of Rosalind's claiming to be a magician, capable of divining the future. Rosalind here introduces a popular topic, magic, a subject that fascinated Elizabethan audiences. In addition, Rosalind's prophesying the multiple marriages for the next day foreshadows the arrival of Hymen in the final scene. Act 5 Scene 4. Analysis. The stage is set and the couples are assembled. Sylvius and Phoebe in the characteristic pastoral style offer to die if their love is unrequited, and Jax, in one of his usual critical quips, comments that Touchstone and Audrey are fools. Touchstone, of course, would not agree. From his opening speech, he seems almost unapproachable. In fact, his actions are so affected in this scene, suggestive of dramatic royalty on stage, that Touchstone becomes the consummate fool among the courtiers and noblemen. Of course, however, only such a master dramatist as Shakespeare could devise such magnificent foolery. Rosalind is imagined by those on stage to be summoned by the magical enchantment of Hymen, and from her and Celia's entrances on stage until the epilogue, the play becomes a fully realized masque. Short though it is, however, this petite masque is the forerunner of Shakespeare's grand masque in The Tempest. Jax is perhaps as consistent a character from beginning to end as can be found in all of literature. For that reason, his exit is wonderfully choice and witty. He who criticized country living from the start, chooses to remain in the country, while all those from the city or court who extolled the virtues of pastoral life are now ready to return to their former lives in the city. The fact that Jack's farewell is put in the form of a last will and testament is fitting because he will join Duke Frederick in a religious life, becoming, as it were, dead to the world. Yet in no sense will the memory of the mercurial Jacks be dead. His melodramatic posing, his operatic melancholy, and his realization that life itself is probably no more than a theatrical spectacle, all these qualities immortalize Jacks, the quintessence of the man apart. Act 5 Epilogue. Analysis. A good wine needs no bush, Rosalind's gay comment on the play, is a well-known proverb. The ivy bush was a well-known sign of the Elizabethan vintner, and the key to the humor here is to be found in Rosalind's "If I Were a Woman." The role of Rosalind, remember, was always played by a beardless young chap. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel.